Welcome to StoriesX, where the extraordinary meets the impactful. Today we bring you a jaw-dropping story. Snoop Dogg, disguised as a homeless man, uncovers shocking police bias in Central Park. This bold social experiment is making waves across the nation, igniting heated debates and calling for change. Stay tuned to witness every twist and turn as it unfolds. Before we begin this story, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees of Central Park, casting dappled shadows across the wide pathways and green expanses. It was a tranquil scene, typical of summer days, punctuated by joggers, dog walkers, and families enjoying the fresh air. Among them sat a figure who blended into the background, yet commanded attention in his own way. A black man in a worn hoodie, his belongings stuffed into a tattered backpack at his feet. He looked every bit the part of a homeless individual down on his luck. The frayed hem of his jeans and mismatched sneakers suggested a life lived on the margins. Beside him, on a weathered bench, sat a crumpled brown paper bag containing the remnants of a sandwich. This man, however, was far from ordinary. Beneath the carefully curated appearance was none other than Snoop Dogg, the global music icon, now incognito for a bold social experiment. Snoop had spent weeks preparing for this day. Frustrated by stories of bias and injustice faced by those living on the streets, he decided to experience it firsthand. His plan was simple: pose as a homeless man and observe how society treated him, particularly those in positions of power. His opportunity came sooner than expected. Across the park, a white female police officer, Officer Rachel DeLaney, patrolled with her partner, Officer Higgins. DeLaney was known for her firm but fair approach, yet moments of impatience sometimes betrayed her bias. Higgins, on the other hand, was a steady and cautious presence. As the officers strolled closer, DeLaney's gaze fixed on Snoop. Her eyes narrowed slightly, taking in his tattered clothing and the faint slump of his shoulders. "Another one camping out?" she muttered to Higgins, motioning toward Snoop. "I'm tired of these guys loitering." Higgins hesitated. "He's not causing any trouble," he pointed out. "Just sitting there." DeLaney didn't falter. "It's about presence. If we don't check this now, these benches turn into their permanent homes. Let's see what he's up to." The officers approached, their boots crunching against the gravel path. Snoop didn't move, his focus on the breadcrumbs he sprinkled for a cluster of sparrows at his feet. "You can't stay here all day," DeLaney said sharply. "This is a public space, not a shelter." Snoop looked up, his hood partially concealing his face. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied calmly, his voice unshaken. "That's not the point," DeLaney shot back. "We've had complaints about vagrants scaring families. You got somewhere to go?" Snoop's lips twitched slightly. "This bench works for now," he said, reaching into his paper bag to retrieve an apple. DeLaney frowned, her irritation mounting. "You got ID on you?" Snoop sighed, setting down the apple. He rummaged through his coat and pulled out a wallet, handing over an ID that read, "Calvin Broadus." DeLaney scrutinized the ID, her brow furrowing. "Calvin Broadus," she said slowly, glancing at him. "This you?" "Last time I checked," Snoop replied, meeting her gaze evenly. "You homeless?" DeLaney pressed. "Does it matter?" Snoop countered. "I'm not breaking any laws." Higgins shifted uncomfortably. "Rachel, he's not doing anything wrong. Let's move on." DeLaney hesitated, her grip tightening on the ID before handing it back. "Fine," she said, though her tone was anything but resolved. "But don't think this is your personal hangout. We'll be keeping an eye on you." As the officers walked away, Higgins glanced over his shoulder. "You think he's really homeless?" DeLaney shrugged. "I don't know, but something about him doesn't sit right. He's too calm." Snoop watched them leave, his expression neutral but his mind racing. He'd seen it, the flicker of doubt, the underlying bias. It wasn't blatant, but it was there. The seeds of confrontation had been planted, and Snoop knew it was only a matter of time before they bore fruit. As the shadows grew longer and the park began to empty, Snoop leaned back on the bench, a faint smile playing on his lips. He wasn't just testing the officers, he was testing the system. And the day was far from over. The air in Central Park carried an almost electric tension, as Officer Rachel DeLaney and Officer Higgins circled back toward the bench where Snoop Dogg, still disguised as Calvin Broadus, sat. Their earlier interaction had done little to alleviate DeLaney's suspicion. She was convinced there was something off about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Snoop remained seated, his posture relaxed as he watched a few joggers pass by. He reached into his paper bag for the last piece of his sandwich, his movements deliberate. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze before he even glanced their way. "Back again?" Snoop asked, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge of challenge. "Don't get smart," DeLaney snapped, stopping a few feet from the bench. Her tone was sharper this time, laced with irritation. "We've had reports of disturbances in the area. Mind telling us why you're still here?" "Last I checked," Snoop replied evenly. "Central Park's a public space. Didn't know sitting on a bench was a disturbance." Higgins sighed, clearly exasperated. "Rachel, maybe we should move on. He's not doing anything illegal." DeLaney shot him a look, her jaw tightening. "You don't know that. He's been sitting here for hours. People don't do that unless they're hiding something." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe I just like the view." DeLaney ignored the remark, stepping closer. "Let me see that ID again," she demanded. Snoop hesitated for a moment before pulling the wallet from his coat pocket and handing it over. DeLaney scrutinized the ID once more, flipping it over as though expecting to find something hidden. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered. Higgins leaned in to look at the ID. "It checks out," he said. "We've already called it in." DeLaney's frustration deepened. She returned the ID with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Fine," she said tersely, "but I'm keeping my eye on you." Snoop accepted the ID without a word, tucking it back into his pocket. His calm demeanor remained unshaken, but his mind was working furiously. He could see the thin veneer of authority cracking under DeLaney's growing suspicion. As the officers lingered, a small crowd began to gather nearby. People who had been enjoying the park's serenity now turned their attention to the unfolding scene. Among them was a young mother with a stroller, a group of teenagers, and an elderly man feeding pigeons. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to quiet disapproval. "He's not doing anything," the young mother said aloud, her voice tinged with indignation. DeLaney's gaze snapped to her. "Ma'am, please move along. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," the woman replied. "It concerns all of us when someone's being treated unfairly." The murmurs of agreement from the crowd grew louder. Snoop remained silent, letting the scene play out. This was exactly what he'd anticipated. A raw, unfiltered glimpse into how authority responded when questioned. DeLaney's face flushed, but she maintained her composure. "If you're not going to move along, I'll have to ask you to disperse," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You should be asking yourself why you're even here," the elderly man feeding pigeons interjected. "This park is for everyone, isn't it?" DeLaney's irritation boiled over. She turned back to Snoop. "You're causing a scene," she said, as if blaming him for the crowd's reaction. "Funny," Snoop said quietly. "I thought that was your job." The comment landed like a slap, and DeLaney's lips pressed into a thin line. Higgins stepped forward, placing a calming hand on her arm. "Rachel, let it go," he said softly. "This isn't worth it." But DeLaney wasn't ready to back down. She turned to the crowd. "This man's behavior is suspicious, and we're ensuring everyone's safety. If you have concerns, you can file a complaint with the precinct." The young mother scoffed. "We all see what's going on here. You're not fooling anyone." DeLaney's partner stepped in again, his voice firmer this time. "We're leaving," Higgins said, his tone brooking no argument. He gently but firmly guided DeLaney away from the bench, leaving the crowd murmuring in their wake. As the officers walked back toward their cruiser, Snoop leaned back on the bench, his faint smile returning. He could feel the shift in the air, the crackling unease of authority challenged. The experiment was working and the day was far from over. The air in Central Park hung heavy with tension after the officers retreated, leaving Snoop Dogg, still disguised as Calvin Broadus, on the bench. The murmurs of the crowd lingered like an echo, a mixture of indignation, curiosity, and whispered conversations. But Snoop knew that the seeds of something larger had been planted, seeds that would soon grow into an uncontainable force. As he sat there, he noticed an older black man cautiously approach. The man, dressed in a modest jacket and jeans, paused a few feet away before speaking. "Saw what happened," the man said, his voice low but steady. "You all right?" Snoop nodded. "Yeah, I've seen worse." The man hesitated before sitting down on the edge of the bench. "Name's Harold," he said. "I come here every day to read and clear my mind, but seeing that..." He shook his head. "That ain't right." "It's not," Snoop agreed, his voice calm. "But sometimes it's gotta be seen to be believed." Harold frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean by that?" Snoop's gaze flicked to the gathering crowd and then back to Harold. "Let's just say some truths need to come to light, and today's one of those days." Before Harold could respond, the unmistakable hum of a police cruiser returning to the park caught their attention. Snoop's demeanor didn't shift, but Harold's shoulders tensed as Officer Rachel DeLaney stepped out of the vehicle, alone this time. Her partner Higgins remained in the car, his expression one of visible discomfort. DeLaney approached with purposeful strides, her eyes locked on Snoop. The faint traces of frustration from earlier had deepened into something more resolute, almost personal. "You're still here," she said, her voice clipped. "I told you this isn't a place for loitering. It's a public park," Snoop replied, his tone unwavering. "Unless you've got a law against sitting, I'll stay right here." Harold glanced nervously between Snoop and DeLaney, his fingers tightening around the book he'd brought with him. He shifted uncomfortably but didn't move. "I'm giving you one last chance," DeLaney said, her hand resting on the baton at her hip. "Leave, or I'll have to take further action." Snoop's calm exterior didn't falter. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward her. "You're live," he said simply. DeLaney's eyes flicked to the screen where a live stream was broadcasting to thousands of viewers. The comments scrolled rapidly, filled with outrage, support, and calls for accountability. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, uncertainty flashed across her face. "What's this supposed to prove?" she asked, though her voice lacked the conviction it had moments before. "That people deserve better than this," Snoop replied. "And now, everyone gets to see what better looks like." The crowd, emboldened by the live stream, began to murmur more loudly. A woman with a stroller stepped forward. "Why can't he sit here?" she demanded. "What's he doing that's so wrong?" Another voice chimed in, this time a teenage boy on a skateboard. "Yeah, leave him alone. He's not hurting anybody." DeLaney's hand dropped from her baton as she took in the growing crowd and the live stream still capturing every moment. Her frustration was palpable, but so was her growing awareness of the scrutiny she faced. "This isn't about him," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "We're just trying to maintain order," Harold said, finally finding his voice. "Order's not harassing a man for sitting on a bench. Order's treating everyone with respect, no matter what they look like." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices rising in support of Harold and Snoop. DeLaney's face flushed as she glanced back toward the cruiser, where Higgins remained seated, watching the scene unfold with folded arms. "You know what?" DeLaney said finally, her tone sharp but resigned. "I've had enough of this." She turned and walked back to the cruiser, slamming the door behind her. The crowd cheered as the vehicle pulled away, but Snoop's expression remained measured. Harold turned to him, his voice filled with admiration. "You handled that better than most. But why go through all this trouble?" Snoop looked at the older man, his eyes steady. "Because someone has to," he said. "And sometimes, the only way to change things is to make sure everyone's watching." As the crowd began to disperse, their conversations still buzzing with what they'd witnessed, Snoop leaned back on the bench. The live stream continued to roll, capturing not just the confrontation but the conversations and connections that followed. It was a start, just the beginning of something bigger. The sun began to dip lower over Central Park, casting long shadows across the grass as the crowd around Snoop Dogg thinned. Those who remained exchanged hushed conversations about the events they had just witnessed. For Snoop, disguised as Calvin Broadus, the moment had crystallized. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a movement unfolding in real time. As Snoop leaned back on the bench, a young reporter holding a microphone approached cautiously. Her cameraman followed, adjusting the lens as he prepared to record. "Excuse me," she began, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "I'm Vanessa Cho from Channel 8 News. Would you mind telling us what just happened here?" Snoop's gaze flicked to the camera, his expression unreadable. After a brief pause, he nodded. "Sure. Why not?" Vanessa hesitated, surprised by his agreement, then launched into her questions. "You've stirred quite a reaction here today. Some are calling it an example of systemic bias, while others say it's a misunderstanding. What's your take?" Snoop leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not just about today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about how easy it is for people to judge someone based on appearances. I'm here to expose that." "And you're doing this dressed as," Vanessa prompted. "As someone people often ignore," Snoop replied. "A homeless man, a nobody. Because that's who gets treated like this every day. But here's the thing. I'm not invisible and neither are they." The cameraman gave Vanessa a thumbs up, signaling that the footage was rolling smoothly. Vanessa's curiosity deepened as she asked, "So what do you hope to achieve?" Snoop's expression softened slightly. "I want people to see the truth, not just about the way we treat each other, but about how we're all complicit if we stay silent. Change doesn't start with a policy. It starts with awareness." The interview concluded, and Vanessa thanked Snoop before moving on to interview bystanders who had witnessed the confrontation. Meanwhile, Snoop turned his attention to the live stream still running on his phone. Comments continued to flood in, a mix of outrage, praise, and disbelief. At a nearby precinct, Officer Rachel DeLaney sat in the break room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The earlier encounter with Snoop gnawed at her, replaying in her mind like a broken record. She wasn't proud of how she'd handled the situation, and the thought of her actions being broadcast live only deepened her unease. "Delaney," a voice called from the doorway. It was Captain Jane Monroe, her sharp gaze fixed on the younger officer. "My office now." Rachel followed the captain down the hall, her heart pounding. Once inside, Monroe gestured for her to sit. "What's going on out there?" Monroe demanded, holding up her phone with the live stream paused on the screen. "I've got half the city calling me and they're not happy." Rachel hesitated, searching for the right words. "I thought he was loitering. I was trying to keep the park safe." "From what?" Monroe countered, her tone sharp. "From a man eating a sandwich on a bench? Or was it the hoodie that made him suspicious?" The words hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss. Monroe's voice softened slightly, though it retained its edge. "Look, I'm not here to ruin your career, but you need to understand the weight of that badge you wear. Every decision you make reflects on this department. And today, you failed." Rachel's shoulders sagged as the gravity of the situation sank in. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. Monroe leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "You start by owning up to your mistakes. Apologize if you have to, and then you learn. Bias isn't always intentional, but it's always harmful. Remember that." Back at the park, the atmosphere had shifted. As the crowd dwindled, a small group of advocates from a local homeless outreach organization approached Snoop. They introduced themselves, expressing gratitude for the light he was shedding on an issue they fought against daily. "We'd love to work with you," one of them said, a young woman named Mia. "Your platform could really amplify our message." Snoop nodded, appreciating their dedication. "Let's make it happen," he said. "This isn't just my fight, it's everyone's." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in shades of gold and orange, Snoop gathered his belongings and prepared to leave. But the day's events had already set something in motion: conversations, reflections, and a ripple of change that wouldn't stop here. He had played his part, but the real work was just beginning. As the moonlight bathed Central Park in a soft glow, the city buzzed with chatter about the day's events. Snoop Dogg, disguised as Calvin Broadus, had not only captured the attention of bystanders, but ignited a citywide conversation. His bold social experiment was trending online, the live stream reaching millions, sparking debates about systemic bias, privilege, and accountability. At a late-night press conference outside the NYPD headquarters, Captain Jane Monroe addressed a sea of reporters. Flanked by senior officers, she spoke with a tone of measured authority. What happened today in Central Park is a stark reminder that bias can creep into any interaction, she began. Our department holds itself to the highest standards, and when those standards are not met, we must take immediate action. Behind her, Officer Rachel DeLaney stood silently, her face pale and reflective. The fallout from her actions weighed heavily on her. Though she had avoided outright disciplinary measures, Monroe had made it clear that this was a turning point in her career. For Rachel, it was a wake-up call, an opportunity to confront her own assumptions and strive for better. Meanwhile, Snoop was sitting in a small recording studio on the city's outskirts. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the gentle hum of equipment as a producer adjusted the settings. On the screen before him were thousands of comments from his live stream, each one a testament to the impact his experiment had made. A knock on the door broke his concentration. Mia, the advocate from the homeless outreach organization, stepped inside. She carried a folder brimming with documents and a look of quiet determination. "You ready?" she asked. Snoop nodded, setting his phone aside. "Let's do this." They spent hours crafting a plan to harness the momentum of the day. From collaborations with advocacy groups to community workshops on implicit bias, Snoop was determined to turn his moment of exposure into a sustained movement. His goal was clear: real, actionable change. Back in Central Park, the bench where Snoop had conducted his experiment had become a symbolic landmark. Visitors left notes, flowers, and messages of hope on its surface. Among them was a small plaque engraved with the words Snoop had written, "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The following week, the local community held an open forum to discuss the incident and its implications. Residents, advocates, and even some NYPD officers attended. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, anger, hope, and a shared determination to address the issues that had been laid bare. Rachel DeLaney stood at the back of the room, listening intently. When the floor opened for comments, she hesitated before stepping forward. I'm Officer DeLaney," she began, her voice unsteady but sincere. "I was one of the officers involved in the incident last week. I made assumptions that day, assumptions that were wrong and hurtful. I'm here because I want to do better, and I'm committed to learning how to serve this community with the respect it deserves." Her words were met with a mix of reactions, some skeptical, others cautiously supportive. But the act of showing up and taking accountability marked the beginning of a personal transformation for Rachel. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of Snoop's experiment continued to spread. The NYPD announced new training programs focused on de-escalation and bias awareness. Local schools incorporated discussions about privilege and prejudice into their curricula. Community members formed coalitions to address systemic inequities. For Snoop, the journey was far from over. He attended meetings, spoke at rallies, and used his platform to amplify voices that often went unheard. But he also knew the importance of balance. One evening, he returned to Central Park, this time without the disguise. He sat on the same bench watching the sun set over the city. A young boy approached hesitantly, clutching a notebook. "Are you the guy from the video?" he asked. Snoop smiled, nodding. "Yeah, that's me. What's up?" The boy's eyes lit up. "I just wanted to say thanks. My dad showed me the video and we talked about it. It made me think about how I treat people." Snoop's smile widened. "That's what it's all about, little man. Keep thinking and keep doing better." As the boy ran off, Snoop leaned back, his heart full. The work ahead was daunting, but moments like these made it all worthwhile. The bench, the park, the city. They were all part of a larger story, one that he was determined to help rewrite. The lesson was clear. Change starts with a single act of courage, but it takes a collective effort to sustain. And as long as there were voices willing to speak, minds willing to listen, and hearts willing to act, there was hope for a better future. As the dust settled on Snoop Dogg's bold experiment, the message was clear. Systemic bias thrives in silence, but courage and accountability can shatter its grip. By stepping into the shoes of the marginalized, Snoop exposed the uncomfortable truths many prefer to ignore. His actions sparked a movement, proving that awareness is the first step toward justice and unity. Real change demands collective action, And this story reminds us all that confronting injustice is not just necessary, it's transformative.